I'm going to encourage all of you to read the very distinguished biographies of many of our panelists today, but I do want to quickly suggest that the nature of this panel, led by Rebecca, is to really dig deeper into the conversation that we've just had. And she will be joined by Michelle McLean, who is the President and CEO of HealthcareCan, the national voice of Canada's hospitals, health authorities, and health research institutions. Also, Dr. Jennifer Zelmer, who is the inaugural President and CEO of Healthcare Excellence Canada, the new organization formed in 2020 through the amalgamation of the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement and Canadian Patient Safety Institute to institute safer, higher quality, and more coordinated patient-centered healthcare. And of course, last but not least, Dr. Andreas Laupacis, who is currently the consulting editor of the Canadian Medical Association Journal, a board member of the Waterloo Regional Health Network, and professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. I'll let you take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. So I do not have to introduce our esteemed panel. Maybe I'll just start with some questions. I think we also have a couple of audience questions as well. And maybe after each question, if people did want to come up and join the discussion, we could do that. We have about 4 or 5 questions to go through. So maybe we'll start with the first question and ask each of the panelists if they'd like to answer. Given the theme of the conference is research is care and care is research, what does this mean to you and where do you think we are today? So Jennifer, do you want to answer that first?
Sure, I can. Oh, it's amazing. There's a button. There we go. Does this work? Yes. Excellent. So I was really interested in the theme of the conference. I think it's such a nice bringing together. And also the flip side, right? Not just care as research, but also research as care. I think if we start fundamentally to what matters to each person, so going back to the principle of person-centered care, then both care and new knowledge that comes through care and that influences care matter to lots of us. And it's that combination, I think, that offers possibility, and not just thinking about it as a one-way travel from research to care, but also thinking about what do we learn through the care environment, what do we learn about what matters to individuals, to families, to communities, that also influences the research process at the same time.
Yeah. Thanks. Michelle?
As someone that spends a lot of time talking to government about the importance of health research. For me, that research is care and care is research is one of the most effective ways to explain the value of health research to government decision makers. I think it reflects a knowledge that the community and patients have always had, that research and health research and clinical trials are an integral part of their care pathway. But it's also the most accessible way for decision makers to engage with health research. And it's a really effective way to describe the importance of health research in patient care journey. And I think it makes it much more tangible for our decision makers than when you're trying to describe the value of basic biomedical research. A lot of that sails over the heads of decision makers who aren't trained in the field. So for me, it's a very effective way to bring this to politicians and decision makers in a way they can engage with.
Okay. Andreas?
So that was a terrific talk, Rebecca. And I'd agree with you that every one of us in this room would want to have access to and whatnot, would like to not have to pay a fortune to get the treatments that you described. I'm going to actually take the perspective of someone who's a retired hospitalist and palliative care doc, who now in my retirement am on the board of the Waterloo Regional Health Network that's being told by the Ontario government that we got to find some cost savings. And also as a former researcher. And when I hear you say research is care, that then makes me think that at least some research should be publicly funded. And maybe out of the healthcare operating budget. But if that's the case, then you as a researcher are now part of the healthcare system. And you have to spend time working with the healthcare system to figure out how to operationalize that. And when I looked at your treatments, they all seem super expensive, super specialized. And so my thought would be to have, you're talking about, say, non-small cell lung cancer, which is more common cancer. Anybody diagnosed that would be referred to a place where they would get a healthcare system approved genetic test or molecular test to determine what their gene is and whether they're eligible for a clinical trial. But then they would have to be referred to that clinical trial. There's no way that treatment's going to be close to my home, which is a farm, 50 minutes away from Waterloo. I'm just going to have to either go to the Waterloo Regional Health Network or possibly to Toronto. I'm just going to have to accept that. But we also need to make sure there is a gradient, right? There's a bunch of treatments that I would say are like clearly research, and ones where the research is now so straightforward or so convincing that it's now part of treatment, that you as a researcher need to help the health system set up a network that would allow the healthcare system to operationalize that. And I was just the managing editor of a paper that we published in the CMAJ this year from a group of oncologists in Alberta who documented that for non-small cell lung cancer, they are spending 5 times more visits with each patient on immunotherapy than they did before. And that's great because it's leading to much better outcomes. But they're saying, like, we just can't manage anymore. So that what I didn't hear in your talk was, what are the health human resource implications for this? Like, they're huge. And they're beyond oncology. When I talk to my internal medicine colleagues, they kind of complain about many of their patients admitted to internal medicine are not complaining about looking after the patients, but there are patients that are treated with these who have infections and need to go into internal medicine, et cetera. They end up in the ICU. So I guess my message would be, if research is care, and I think it should be for some cancers, the researchers then have to accept that they got to work with and possibly even within the healthcare system, which is kind of a scary thought because the healthcare system is not exactly innovative, to make that work. And also, I think researchers need to set priorities. You can't just expect that every clinical trial that every oncologist wants to do is going to be care. There's going to have to be, and I would rather have you set the priorities than the government. So there's got to be some common way for the healthcare system and researchers to sort of say, these are the priorities. Because the worst case scenario is a whole bunch of small, underpowered studies that actually don't answer any questions at all.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. And I might just respond to a couple of those things. So immunotherapy, for example, in early stage rectal cancer, locally advanced rectal cancer, immunotherapy is expensive, infinitely less expensive than chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, the recovery from surgery, the second surgery, which most patients end up having. So I think, we have to make that connection. I think what patients deserve is access to research. So the research studies themselves may not be the care, but having the infrastructure within a hospital ecosystem to provide access to research, I think, is what is standard. And I would argue, for example, in my husband's case with the PARP inhibitor, we have a drug that has hundreds and thousands of patients that have received this drug through clinical trials, through standard of care, not with the cancer he has, but with many other cancers with good efficacy, to the point where some people are saying our BRCA-mutated patients on a PARP inhibitor with stage 4 ovarian cancer, can we call them cured? Like they've been on this for 10 years. Did we cure this type of ovarian cancer? Like something we never thought was possible. And yet the only way for him to actually access that drug outside of paying for it himself is some kind of Health Canada regulated clinical trial that would have to be collecting SAEs and all the regulatory framework across the entire country. That doesn't make sense, right? Why can't you have that on a clinical trial in a rural hospital? Why is it that the regulatory framework is such that that's impossible? So I think some of the barriers, we created them, we built them to protect patients, and they don't protect patients anymore. But your point about the cost is well taken, and I think that's where we need some of that. A lot of our therapeutics, particularly Canadian-made therapeutics, there's no pull into the market. So there's no opportunity for a Canadian biotech company to say, if I make this cell therapy and it works, will you procure it as a hospital or as a healthcare system? We have no market pull for any of these novel therapeutics. Many of them can be developed here in Canada, particularly, I think, in the biotherapy space. So I think we need to think different.
The market's international, right? It's not just
And that's why they leave, and they go to the U.S. because there's market pull in the U.S. But if you said to Canadian biotech, who's making a brand new CAR T, if this treatment works, we will procure it preferentially in Canada for the benefit of Canadian patients. That's market pull. We don't have anything like that, and other countries do. Germany has it, Singapore has it, UK has it, US has it. We don't have it, and that's why we don't make things here. They leave. Michelle?
You're absolutely right. We don't have it, but I think there's a window of opportunity to build it. And we now exist in Canada in a situation where we're going to have to re-architect not just our trade systems, but all of our systems to become much more self-reliant, much more focused on a made-in-Canada approach. So if there was ever a time to make the argument to governments that this is the direction we need to go, it's now, where the federal government certainly is looking for industry initiatives that will attract investment and grow industry. And frankly, I've often said healthcare is Canada's original nation-building project. And I think we can advance it at the federal, provincial levels so that they see a life sciences industry as more than just a pharmaceutical industry investment in Canada. So I think there's huge opportunity in this moment of crisis to re-architect what we are doing on the industry side.
I know a lot of what I talked about in terms of trials were sort of these more discovery to care trials, but of course there's many trials. There's pragmatic trials, there's effectiveness trials that I think Andreas answers, speak to what you're describing, which is, making sure that something is valuable, for example, in a public healthcare system, so these larger trials that really define care. And so I'm wondering, and maybe I'll start again with Jennifer, who do you think benefits most from the different types of trials, and can the strategies we use to help integrate one type of trial support all types of trials, or do we need different strategies for different trials across the country?
I mean, I'm not sure the answer in healthcare is ever one size fits all. So door number 2, I think is absolutely the right approach. I do think we've learned some about what works better in what circumstances, but we're having to adapt that too. As the situation is changing, think absolutely the kinds of situations you talked about. Think also the way AI is changing our understanding of the landscape and our understanding of how we actually even interpret evidence and effectiveness and identify potential candidates for trials. So I think all of those things apply. I also think, and this is kind of putting on an old hat for me, at one point I was an innovation broker for the Ontario government. And we also need to better match the readiness of industry and research to the kinds of information and response that would be required to scale up this kind of approach. So, we had various companies approaching us who weren't able, for example, to compare their innovation to standard of care. So we got quite far down the path with one that the government was prepared to invest in on exactly the kind of basis that was talked about. And then we realized that actually the outcomes that it was achieving were not as good as the current standard of care. And so that more sophisticated conversation, I think, requires all of us to be able to talk differently about the kinds of approaches we're doing, to bring in the health economics that Andreas mentioned, absolutely, but also to have a better understanding of real-world evidence about what is the current situation now and how do different types of interventions compare to that for different populations, because it won't be just everyone is the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we have a couple of audience questions. Do we want to put them up now, or? Okay, great. So this is kind of a word cloud question. What is the most compelling argument for why we need to invest in making clinical trials more numerous and accessible in Canada? Hard with the sunlight. I'm not sure if people are not putting anything in, or they were thinking. I thought the computer was thinking, maybe. I can't. All right, so to provide and care for cancer patients in need, discovery demands inclusion, unlocking every patient's potential, make cheaper therapeutics, researchers' care, patient hope, making care more accessible. Research is an investment, love that. Equity in care, better outcomes, excellent building, economic development. Yeah, I think those are all really excellent answers. And I think we had a second question before the... what is the biggest challenge in making trials more abundant and accessible? And this is a multiple choice. Funding and resources, system fragmentation and silos, cultural resistance, lack of awareness, regulatory ethics hurdles, workforce capacity. Right, so it looks like system fragmentation and funding and resources, which I think probably is pretty accurate on that one. All right, wonderful. So what are the most important system enablers to make the vision of research as care and care as research real? Anyone want to start with that one?
First last time, so.
It's on, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly don't know the answer, but, you know, I was a person that 40 years ago was trained by Dave Sackett in that paradigm that you showed, and those of you who don't know, Dave was sort of the father of evidence-based medicine and one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And you know, you're starting to convince me, you know, that the advent of genetic and molecular testing is allowing us, or allowing you, to identify patients that have a really high chance of benefiting from a treatment, and also patients who, without a new treatment, are probably going to do really, really badly. So where before I would sort of say, yeah, you've shown that 50 people are still alive, I would have sort of said, yeah, but we need a big trial. And I'm sort of thinking, well, you know, maybe in some we don't. So I do think that message is a big enabler. I mean, that people with, and I think your photo of the guy with the six-pack, although slightly...
Not my husband.
No, I know. But, you know, although slightly over the top, is really a great sell. Like, some of these treatments are not as toxic as others, et cetera. So I think making that clearly, but at the same time being really honest about, you know, one thing that wasn't in your talk, to be honest, was like what proportion of these trials are totally negative or harm patients? And, you know, these patients, I'm sure your husband, you would know it way better than me, went through some really tough, dark days during the treatment. They're not easy treatment. So, but making the clear case, but the realistic case, because if you're going to get people in the healthcare system to fund it, they're going to be funding the people that it doesn't work in as well as the ones that it does, right? And then, at some point, maybe tying a CEO's pay for performance to something around clinical trials. So like on our board, every year, we set a certain proportion, and I hate part of that, but part of it it focuses the board on that, and it does focus the CEO. I would not make it number of patients entered into a clinical trial, because I am worried that there'll be a bunch of trials that aren't that well designed, but actually spending some time sitting down with, and I did notice that only 7% of the people here identified as sort of working as healthcare administrators. So there is a bit of a feel of us versus them in this room. And I think you got to get to kind of us together if you're going to argue that your research is healthcare. But sitting down with those people and say, okay, what would be the best metric of success? And those will probably be different at UHN or the Ottawa Hospital where I used to work than at the Kitchener-Waterloo Regional Health Network, because we don't have nearly as many researchers as you folks do. A couple thoughts.
Maybe I'll just respond to that. I think that really is an important piece of it, metrics around research. And so research is not just, there are no metrics in Ontario for Ontario Health around funding for hospitals that have anything to do with research. And in fact, you are not allowed to spend any provincial money on the operations of research. So research institutes end up being funded by the Research Support Fund through Tri-Council, which is, if you're a research-intensive hospital, somewhere between 11 and 15% overhead. Philanthropy, that for most philanthropic grants, 0% overhead. Industry contracts, which we get about maybe 30 to 40% overhead. So we're always scraping, the bottom of the barrel and looking under the couch cushions to find enough money to run the operations of clinical trials. So it's really interesting what you said, because our CEO now, Cameron Love at the Ottawa Hospital, one of his chosen metrics for his CEO report card is clinical trials. But there's a challenge there when you can't use any provincial dollars to fund that. So saying that researchers care and understanding that, in my mind, at a government level, is understanding that, number one, number of clinical trials offered to patients, number of patients who are offered clinical trials, maybe not that decide to go on, but that are offered clinical trials. Those kinds of metrics are important and should be part of the funding scheme for, at least for academic research hospitals. And that there's funding associated, not with the studies themselves, but with the infrastructure that allows those studies to be rolled out, whether it's in outpatient clinics or in the hospital ecosystem. And that doesn't exist, and it really needs to. And just one other small story I'll tell. When my husband and I went down to the NIH, every single person there was so wonderful. And I actually stopped the medical records clerk and I said, why is everyone here so friendly and happy and kind? And she said to me, oh, honey, it's easy to love your job when you're making miracles happen. I love that story because what it tells me is that research doesn't just help patients, it helps the entire ecosystem. Every single person who believes they're part of that has better job satisfaction, has more hope. I think there's a real story there.
Okay. I just want to pick up on that notion of broad participation, offering it to, every patient that comes into a hospital is offered, or at least offered information about clinical trials that may be available. That's a key enabler of change. We must engage the public in the vision of what we want to create, because while we default to thinking that government makes all of the decisions that impact the ecosystem, their bosses are the public. And so raising awareness in public simply by asking them, do they want more information about clinical trials, opening their eyes to the possibility, and connecting research to care in a patient's mind, in the public mind, is a very effective way to change perception of government. Because, again, I know we think, well, we have to convince government, and we do. But the public is a very effective advocate and will have as much influence over where the future of healthcare goes as we as the advocates or the researchers do. So I think as broadly as we can tell the story around clinical trials and see engagement of public as a priority, that will help to bring down some of the structural barriers that you're talking about.
That's such a good point. Jennifer, thoughts on enablers?
Yeah, if I can maybe just build off of your last comments, and then I'll keep going as well. You know, I think the other thing that we need to think about is what are the endpoints that matter to patients and to families and communities so that we are engaging effectively as well. So that's another, Andreas, you talked about, you know, the need for a connection between the research enterprise and the health system enterprise. I think there's also that continued need for connection to patients, families, and communities about what are the important endpoints. Because then it's much easier, right, if it's focused on something that matters to you. And sometimes that will absolutely be survival, and sometimes that will be other things. It may be a reduction in side effects. It may be the ability to have care closer to home. It may be other things. And by thinking about those endpoints that matter, we can design research in ways that make that transition easier as well into the health system, but also into what's important and delivering real value for patients and families. And that to me is one of the enablers. I think I want to go back though to the big circle from the voting in the room and reflect on the fact that clearly all of those are true. Right? So we were talking earlier about at the beginning, our first question, right, was pick the role that you have. And we wanted to pick more than one because probably every one of us wanted to pick more than one on that last list as well. And I think that's also the reality that we're swimming in. Right. It's not one lever that will get us to a different place. It is rethinking, going back to your earlier comments, Rebecca, what now in the environment that we live in now with the kind of research and the kind of targeted therapies that we're able to develop, what does that mean for the regulatory infrastructure, right? When do we start to say, this is no longer research, this is care, full stop, standard of care? And how does the research enterprise need to evolve in that context to be able to think differently about how are we connecting outside of the big cancer centers, for instance, into rural and remote communities? How do we make sure that folks have different types of opportunities in that space and that we're not creating waste, back to Andreas's point as well. You know, I've certainly, with my research hat on, sometimes done research that at the end of the day, the value was maybe not what I thought it was going to be. So putting up my hand there with my research hat on. So how do we make sure that the research that we're doing is also the highest value research that we can design in a way that is streamlined into clinical practices so it doesn't end up with the workload implications. And maybe there's even possibilities of how do we make the right thing to do easier to do in integrating that in different ways as well.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I really like that framework of thinking taking it from that patient's perspective and then building the plan and the enablers on that. I think we have another audience question. Okay, we'll put up the number 3 now. Where should national organizations focus first to accelerate this shift? What actions would have the greatest impact in the next 2 years? Choose one. National strategy and policy alignment, incentives for hospitals and clinicians to build stronger system capacity, better patient and public engagement, integrated data and digital infrastructure. Again, probably all of the above, but yeah, I think national strategy and policy alignment, which I would have to agree. That would be my number one. Maybe, Michelle, I'll pass this one over to you. How can pan-Canadian organizations like HealthcareCan, for example, accelerate this shift of integrating research into care and care into research?
I'm going to answer that question by actually picking up on the question that we asked the audience and their response. And I think the role of organizations like HealthcareCan is really to advocate on behalf of the community with community, but bring forward a common vision. And for anyone that has spent any time working with government, you know the biggest barrier to decision or change is if there are competing views of the world. And so one of the critical things I think we need to do as associations and groups advocating is ensure that we're speaking with one voice about a common vision. I can't count the number of issues that have come before government, and because a lack of consensus on the path forward and the solution has meant that the issue is still to this day unresolved. So I know that we all have a unique lens on both the problem and solution, but I think it's imperative for us to find that commonality when talking with government about the path forward to make it easier to move forward for government because they see that consensus. So to me, whether we call it a national strategy, it has to be a common vision about the path forward to frankly bring down what often in government is a real aversion to risk in picking winners and losers on an issue. If we go together forward with that common vision, the chances of success could just grow exponentially.
Yeah, Andreas?
So when I look at the 53% national strategy and policy alignment, the absolute success story in that immediately comes to mind is not in cancer, but during COVID in the UK, where they decided that randomizing patients admitted to hospital with COVID to dexamethasone or not was their priority. And literally 13% of all patients with COVID in hospital were randomized in a clinical trial across the whole UK. And within 8 months, something like 20,000 patients have been randomized. It was absolutely clear that dexamethasone decreased mortality. It changed practice overnight, like cheap drug, highly effective.
Right.
So what did they have there? They had a strategy where, I hate to harp and be the kind of the bad guy, but they, like the NIH said, like, this dexamethasone trial is our priority. It's not a whole bunch of other trials. Like, this is the one we want you to randomize patients into. And, you know, Canada, we've unfortunately got 13 provincial and territorial healthcare systems. And at the risk of being cynical, my experience, and certainly as an editor at CMAJ, we get, I can't tell you the number of commentaries we say that there should be a strategy on this. And we haven't done this, but we should do that. And our answer is, well, we agree with you, but what are the specific things that need to be done that are going to change it? And in my view, a strategy without, like, in my view in Canada, a national healthcare strategy often isn't nearly as effective as one thinks it will be because
Provincial.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I might have voted for the 21 incentives because it sounds, and in Canada, on the other hand, we have too many pilot studies, so it does sound a bit pilot study-ish, but it's at least getting at the incentives, because my worry would be that a national strategy is going to go where like 99% of national strategies have gone in Canada, which is precisely nowhere.
No, I mean, I think the other thing that the NIH had, I think that again we have not invested in, and again your point about the provincial segregation is problematic. But they, before COVID, they had already invested. I mean, they used part of their NHS budget to do this, but in infrastructure in community hospitals to have clinical trials embedded in community hospitals, they had invested in a single REB, a single contracts process. Like they were well poised to do this, and it's true that having the NHS say this is the strategy, as opposed to, I think we had a CHR call for proposals, and then everyone put in, as opposed to saying, let's get the experts in the room and decide what questions we think are most important to answer for the Canadian population. So
Can
really
I just
good
follow up on
points.
that for a sec? Yeah. So there's a nice paper by, I gather Barry told me that François Lamontagne had talked at this conference some time ago. So François had a paper where, he's an ICU doc from Sherbrooke, where they looked at the CHR funding for COVID. And they looked at a bunch of things, and the CHR there were sort of a whole bunch of varied studies of varied sizes, but relevant to your point was that they looked at all the hospitals that were part of the clinical trial that was being funded, and don't quote me on it, but it was something like 90% of them did not enter a single patient, like not one single one, and this is with COVID, which is like, there were patients with COVID were on the internal medicine wards and the ICU, et cetera. So it just makes your point like absolutely crucial that and it's not surprising. Like if you don't have that infrastructure, why are clinicians who are scared out of their mind that they're going to get infected and their friends are going to get affected spend a lot of time sort of setting up a research infrastructure in the middle of a public health crisis? It just makes no sense.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I think we have one. Sorry, Jennifer, did you want to answer that question on what do you think pan-Canadian organizations can do to support this? Yeah, sorry.
I guess I have to answer that one, hey?
Yeah, I think you probably need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you change this a little bit in terms of, national sometimes gets implied to be federal, or one strategy that's only overarching for the whole country. Like clearly in this space, there are many people who have different abilities to act and move at different levels. And so one, that ignores that is not going to be effective at all. I think the advantage of pan-Canadian health organizations sometimes, and I think HealthcareCan is the same, is there's an opportunity to bridge sometimes that liminal gap between some of those spaces and to bring people together in different ways. And I do think there are some examples actually from the pandemic as well of where people came together in different ways. I'm thinking about some of the testing work that was done, for instance. I happened to sit on the national testing, it had a fancy name, I can't even remember what it was now, national testing thing. It was a way of bringing together all the jurisdictions and saying, okay, we need to learn, first of all, from the natural experiments that are out there, because people were taking very different approaches. But then there was a decision about, here's what we're going to do at the border, for instance. Here's what we're going to do in other places. So I think we have examples of where that can work, but it doesn't work if we sit off in our own corner and only consider one level of this process. It does have to consider the dynamics and complexities of our health system to be able to bring that forward. And that includes thinking about the very different infrastructures, the very different capacities, the very different contexts that, for instance, folks in Nunavut are in compared to folks in downtown Toronto. Those are not the same, and we won't be able to engage at a broad level if we don't think about what are some of those differences and where are the opportunities for bridging them in different ways. Maybe the last thing I'll also say is, I'll go back to the conversation about the common vision. That matters a ton. And getting that, doing the hard work of talking with people right across the country to say, where do we actually have strong alignment and where can we move together? Because often there's not a lot of bridging across that. And so bringing that common voice forward, a good example right now, I think, is the work that Tara Kieran and others are doing around our care and primary care. They've done a lot of work across the country to understand what are those common elements that we agree on, where can we push further and faster together, and that gets you to a place where you can generate momentum in a way that's very different if you're just talking from one space or another.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it is a bit odd that, health research funded federally, but healthcare deliveries funded provincially is becoming this, major sort of barrier to integrating the two. But I think, as you point out, being a bit creative about how those things can work together is probably the best way forward. I'll go to audience question 4. What supports are needed to enable participation at community sites in rural and remote regions? Share your thoughts in 1 to 3 words. I think that's, do we have one more question then? Oh, that's okay. I have a different question for some reason. So I think, yeah, funding, resources, access, definitely, but clearly things like decentralized trials, human resources, yeah, patient navigators. Education.
Can I jump in on this one, Rebecca?
I would love you to, thank you.
So we spend a lot of time working with rural and remote health systems. We have a table that's all the health systems north of 60, for example, and I think they would say all of these things, right? Again, all
Sure.
of these things are true. I would say the first thing, though, is talk to them. You know, they're often outside of research conversations. They won't have a VP of research, for instance. They won't necessarily have what's changing now in terms of where medical schools are located, but they won't have a local medical school. They may not have a local nursing school. They're not necessarily connected into any of these conversations. And so because of that, there's not always a great understanding of what would make it possible for them to be able to participate in different ways. I found it really interesting, you know, when we've opened programs, for instance, that are available across the country in long-term care and primary care, we have a specific substream for rural and remote and northern locations because what they need is different. It's not necessarily the same as what somebody else needs to participate. And so we need to think about it differently. And we need to start with how do we work with them from their perspective to be able to engage them in, versus thinking from our central location, I live in Ottawa, so I also am in this space, out.
Yeah. And does anyone else want to comment on this particular question?
I'd just like to echo what Jennifer said. I think it is about partnership. So much capacity building is a lot of, you know, what funding and resources go to, but again, we have to do it in partnership with those areas, and there are expansion of clinical trials into rural, remote parts of Canada where there is so much to learn from that experience. And it's so critical to that equitable piece that you talked about opening this morning in that list of principles, that if we can't engage and provide this access in rural, remote parts of Canada, we'll never meet that sort of equitable principle that we've set out as important to clinical trials.
Can I maybe just jump in with a specific example? Sorry. So we were talking last week, for instance, about how in Nunavut they've actually trained, with very good results, janitors and others to do basic x-rays. If your clinical trial protocol requires an x-ray to be done with a specification that doesn't allow for that level of flexibility, then they're automatically going to be out. Right? So we just need to be really creative. The most creative people I know in healthcare work in the most resource-constrained spaces. So working from their perspective in and making sure we're not cutting them out because of inadvertently, right? There's no intention to do that, but we write up the protocol, we get it approved through research ethics, and oh my God, it said you had to be, you know, have your x-ray done by an official tech, and then they're going to be out. So building them in from the beginning can make a huge difference.
That's great, yeah. Anne-Marie.
Yes, I simply wanted to now open the floor up, Rebecca, and welcome people up to microphones for comments, for questions. I also want to say that this panel has beautifully set up a conversation we're going to have this afternoon about the Canadian Cancer Society collaboration consultation process that has happened over the past year, where a lot of the bringing together of action planning priorities across the clinical trial system has happened. So thank you so much for doing that. But please, We welcome questions coming up to the microphone. Susan, thank you.
Hi there, I'm Susan Marling, Clinical Trials Ontario. So when we're talking about kind of the silos and the barriers, you know, when we think of it federally, we have health ministries and Ministry of the Economy and ISED and all of these things. And we also have that provincially, right? Ministry of Health, Ministry of the Economy. And in both of these cases, you know, the economic wing of things is really chasing the research piece of it and really supporting it. And of course, health is so consumed with the day-to-day management of a very expensive healthcare system and with dwindling resources over time. And I just wonder, like, is there something that we can conceive that would kind of take care of this at both a federal and a provincial level? Because for research to be care, that integration really has to happen from, you know, structural, financial, so many different ways.
It's a great question, Susan. I know we often fall into the trap of seeing healthcare as provincially funded and federal having spots where they engage or that exchange across a pan-Canadian lens. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of that a lot of the funding for our provincial healthcare system actually flows from the federal government. And at times, the federal government has tied that funding to priorities. And so I think there's a mechanism through the provincial transfers where we can move this agenda up on the provincial priority list as well. So I think there are different ways to be creative in approaching tying the priorities to both levels of government. And I think there are some ways we can do that in the short and the long term. But I think there's a shared priority. Canadians don't really identify one level of government only as a responsibility for healthcare. They see it for both. Therefore, both levels of government are always engaged. It's ensuring that they are prioritizing the same thing. And I think there are some levers, certainly federally, that can help to move those priorities up the provincial priority list.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And that's such an interesting lever that you bring up. It'd really be nice to get consensus around a lever or a few levers that we can really, you know, push in that regard. Thank you.
So I'll fill right in here. A whole bunch of questions. So whenever I try to change something, I'm always faced with a health economist. So I really appreciate your point of view, Andreas. It's the health economists that we ultimately have to convince in our health technology assessment system. We have to start thinking. A number of years ago, we had the Danish government present at our conference talking about public-private partnerships. We have to change our way of thinking in Canada from being a cost, from healthcare and research being a cost, to an investment. And this is a structural change that can happen nationally, but it really has to include the provincial component to it. So we've recently seen Doug Ford, for example, you know, really pushing Ontario because of the tariffs and so forth. We need that from each province. We need to break down the barriers. So that's just a different way of thinking that we have to do. And for a country or a province as a whole, I think that is an opportunity, not just a cost. But from a patient perspective, we have a real issue. And the issue is really about navigation. Patients in one end of the country to find access to a trial in another, if they're lucky enough to find it on the Trial Finder, and we have a new one coming out, thanks to QCRO and the CCS in Canada, which will help to find the trials. But getting people into the trials is really the big problem. And if you're sitting at one end of the country and a trial is done in Toronto, for example, then this is a real issue. So we do not have navigators in this country for patients, people to help them to actually get into trials. We have maybe 4 or 5 in Quebec and 1 in Ontario, and then within patient organizations we do our best, and then with hospitals, within the hospitals, you have it, but not across the board. So one of the structural changes that we have to start thinking about is the navigation part. But to get into the trial, to your very point on molecular profiling, we need to have equitable access to that profiling, again, across the country. So whether it's national navigation or whether it's national prioritization of molecular profiling, there is a role, I think, for the federal government to do that. But Rebecca, we were speaking earlier this morning and you said we need one plan to do this. Well, that one plan has to be a combination of every provincial input into that plan so that the funds will flow both nationally and within the province to do that. And that's where I think there's an opportunity. So my question to you all is, given the fact that we have both provincial and national priorities, and we do have to have the cost effectiveness consideration as well, given our limited resources, how would you see the next step in this plan? What is the first step in creating that strategy that you foresee? I know it's a tough question, so you don't have to be right. No wrong answers.
I'm not sure if I have the answer, but I will comment, Barry, that navigation is not going to be enough. If you cannot leave Prince Edward Island and go to Toronto for a clinical trial because Prince Edward Island won't cover the standard of care costs on that trial. And that is a reality for most patients who don't live in Ontario or Quebec, or maybe BC, where if you live in a smaller province that doesn't have as many clinical trials, even at your major cancer center, you actually cannot participate in a clinical trial at Princess Margaret, let's say. You cannot go there. It's not just about paying for the flight there. It's about paying for the CT scans and the MRIs and the blood work that's considered standard of care on that trial. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. If we truly believe that research is care, and we believe that patients have a right to participate in research, not just it would be nice if they could, and they deserve it, but they actually have a right to participate in a research study if they choose, and if they believe and their oncologist or care provider believes it's the best care, then we need to think about changing the Canada Health Act. Because right now, there is no requirement for a province to pay for a patient to receive clinical trial care in another province. But if they have a standard of care treatment in another province that's not available in their province, that patient has a right to go to the other province, and they have a right to receive that care, and their province will pay back the province that they're treated in. And that might actually be one of the critical changes, because then the federal government can say, we provide you with this funding to deliver care, and research is part of that care. It's part of the medically necessary care that we are providing you funding for. And so we require you to, participate in a national REB, let's say, or we require you to have clinical trials available to patients. And if you don't have that clinical trial available, then you have to allow the patient to cross provincial boundaries to participate in that clinical trial. And it would apply to molecular testing too. I mean, in Quebec, cancer patients get comprehensive molecular testing as standard of care, but not in most other provinces. And I had one young daughter of a patient say to me, well, if I'm allowed to cross provincial boundaries to receive standard of care in another province, then why can't my mom's tumor cross provincial boundaries, and why can't she get molecular testing funded by the Quebec government and my province pays Quebec back? And I don't have an answer to that question. So I just plant it as a seed. I've said it before. Maybe it's not as simple as that. But does it start to change philosophically where we think research sits in the health care delivery? Any other thoughts on Barry's question?
I wanted to pick up on what is the next step? What's the next thing to move things forward? And for me, I'm going to come back to my remarks earlier and point to the Canadian Cancer Society's efforts to really build that consensus and that blueprint for moving forward. That can be very powerful and have tangible outcomes. And although, when it's published, I know it's not yet published, you might disagree with one or two things, or think something should have a greater emphasis and not to a lesser extent. But I would encourage the whole community to really see that as a blueprint that can be moved forward to government as that sort of beacon of where we're headed. And, you know, CCS has a great track record of creating that consensus within community. 20 years ago, they led the efforts around a national cancer strategy for the country that ultimately led to a historic investment at the federal level for cancer and the creation of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. So there's huge power in coming together around a blueprint, knowing, to Andreas's point, it's going to be executed or operationalized differently across the country depending on the regional situation at the provincial level. But it is that North Star for the country that can really unite a community and galvanize government. So to me, it is around moving forward a common vision.
I have good news for you. We'll be workshopping one of those priorities today.
Andreas.
I was a little more enthusiastic about the navigator idea than Rebecca was, because my sense is I do live on a farm, and you know, my nearest hospital has got like 25 beds. And so, you know, if I was diagnosed with a cancer, which wouldn't happen in my local hospital somewhere else, I would find it helpful to have someone, and maybe they can't refer me to a trial outside of my province right now, but could at least, I think ideally you'd have not only a navigator, but that navigator would be powered to order, and the publicly funded system would pay for the genetic tests that the person needs. And then you'd be referred into some kind of network of cholangiocarcinoma experts or whatever. So I think that would be a good first step. And, you know, the business about living in PI is a really interesting one. I hadn't thought about it, but they have to pay for people having a lung. So first of all, if I was a Minister of Health in PEI and CAR T therapy cost $1 million, like I have 300,000 people in the province or something, that $1 million is not a rounding error in my budget, right? Like it's big. So I've got to find a way of kind of paying for that, and presumably I've already got a way with someone who needs a lung transplant. They would go to Toronto, but someone's paying for that. So I'd explore that. I guess, first of all, I'm not a health economist. And secondly, the person that taught me whatever little health economics I know, George Torrance, said once to me, Andreas, economists are as interested in dollars as clinicians are in mercury when they measure blood pressure. We're interested in dollars because they reflect resources needed. And like when I edited that paper from Alberta, honestly, it's the one that intellectually engaged me the most. You look at it and go, holy shit, these people are spending 4 times more per patient. They're getting better outcomes, but that's like unsustainable, right? So if I was you, I would really be working with oncologist groups and you don't train oncologists overnight, right? It takes a long time. And then you need to look at, I mean, one thing clinical trials do very well, so I used to do a lot of them, is you empower the study nurses to do a lot of stuff. And I think probably we could be doing that just in oncology clinics, to have things like having the docs do less of the routine stuff and more of the sort of highly intellectual stuff. But I would be addressing the starting to address the health human resource issue right now.
Maybe I can try and loop through a few of these things. So I'll start with navigators, like you did. And I have such a conflict on this point, because on the one hand, as a patient, you know, I want somebody to help me through a system, right? On the other hand, the fact that a navigator is needed means something's broken in the system. So how can we, really support initiatives like the CCS's one to make it easier to access trials? How can we make it so that it's less complex to have to navigate in the first place? We may still need navigators at the end of the day, but how can we reduce the need for them by making it less complicated in the first place? I actually am a health economist. That is my background. So I'm going to bridge back to actually the earlier question about like where can you find alliances between the industry departments in government and the health departments in government. You could probably find alliances on something like how do we drive down the cost of CAR-T? How do we get as much of an acceleration on the decline in cost there as we saw in sequencing, for instance? That would be an area where you could probably get alignment between the two and some excitement about what's possible. And so it is, as Andreas said, like economics is all about scarce resources. And so how do we find ways of allocating those scarce resources in ways that produce benefit at the end of the day? And sometimes that can be by finding ways to pay for more things. Sometimes it can be finding ways to actually reduce the resources that are required to get to that same outcome. And then I'll maybe loop back finally, Rebecca, to your comment about the Canada Health Act. If research was considered medically necessary, you wouldn't have to change anything in the Canada Health Act. The Canada Health Act says whatever is medically necessary is what this act covers. So it is not currently considered medically necessary. So I wonder if that's what you want to get to, there's maybe a different set of levers than changing the Canada Health Act to get there.
That's very interesting. Yeah, to think about that.
We'll take one last question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a comment. I'm Ganita Matera with Roche, recently joined, but prior to that I represented the provincial cancer programs at the national level. And so when you bring up CAR-T, I was a part of that experience, kind of bringing CAR-Ts to Canada. And you pick up on that point around facilitating, it was really around the inter-provincial agreements. And I think it's underappreciated that things like travel costs and kind of the cost required to get from one end of the country to the other to receive care is actually not necessarily included. And so when we had only Ontario and Quebec offering this treatment, it was actually it took about 2 years to sort of sort out the interprovincial agreements and the cost to receive care from one end, say from BC to get to Quebec, for example. So I think we need to think about that a bit more. And I mean, if we do think that research is care, how do we embed that into the interprovincial agreements so that patients can actually receive the care that they want? Another just quick example is around proton beam therapy. So currently not offered in Canada, but there was an initiative to look at offering it in Toronto. But again, there were recommendations put forward to consider the travel costs that are publicly funded so that patients can actually go there. So I think that that's an important point that we should think about as we think about research as care.
So did you say that travel costs are now being funded?
No.
No.
Oh, I thought
The care is, though.
The care. So how was that achieved?
So it's out of pocket.
For travel costs.
No, but I thought okay then. But the CAR-T
Is standard.
So
it's
standard
care.
now. So like thinking back to when it was first implemented, we had to look at interprovincial agreements. So for example, if a patient in BC wants care in Ontario, what is the cost to the province to send that patient? And so I'm just suggesting that ensuring that travel costs are kind of covered is very important because they aren't necessarily.
Yeah. I think, the CAR-T story, it's such an important story in our country, I think, because, even at our own hospital where we had the CAR-T trial that was able to provide CAR-T cell therapy for patients, our hospital didn't want to allow that study and put significant costs on that study because there was a much larger funding envelope to procure the American product. And to treat patients with that. So whereas we were offering a therapy that was a fraction of the price and available funded through grants, the hospital actually would make money providing the the CAR T through industry, through an American company. So, again, I had this interesting conversation with David Naylor 2 weeks ago around some of the recommendations that had been put forward in the 2015 report, having, for example, a national agency for healthcare innovation, that kind of thing. And that's what I mean when I say we need to have some pull into the market. It shouldn't have been a barrier to create CAR T. There should have been a natural pull to say, if you have a product, we will facilitate the evaluation of that product in the Canadian ecosystem, and if it works, we will procure that product preferentially. That will then bring investment, like private investment, right? If you know that if this product works, we have a market already, and a pathway to market, then that kind of, I think, changes the game. And we have nothing like that in this country. And we need to develop it, and we need to anchor companies in Canada so that we can start to develop more of these therapies for the benefit of our own patients.
Couldn't agree more, Rebecca. And I think we need to understand, certainly at the federal level, that healthcare is still seen as a sector, as a cost center. Yeah. Even when it comes to research, we wouldn't be seen as a prioritized industry for investment. And I think that's how we have to start talking about health research and healthcare, is we are an industry. Healthcare is Canada's second largest employer. And Canadians depend on healthcare in a way, universally depend on healthcare in a way that other industries don't touch. But we're not part of Canada's industrial policy. And I think that's the shift that we need to make, certainly in the minds of government, is to see health research as part of our industrial policy and a real driver of economy, not just improved health outcomes, but a true economy that would prioritize that CAR T cell production here in Canada. So, and I think it's possible because, frankly, the economic crisis will create the opportunity to rethink what is industry in Canada and what does the health research industry mean to Canada.
Thank you. I think we'll finish on that. And I do think that was a brilliant point to finish on, Michelle, particularly in these times where opportunities for Canada, the world is changing, makes a lot of sense. So thank you for finishing on that. Rebecca, brilliant job. Thank you very much. Andreas, Michelle, Jennifer, we're so thrilled to have all of you with us. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. We're going to finish with one more polling question, and then we're going to take a half an hour break and be back here for 11:30. So here we go. The question is and I know that by the way, someone reinforced it. I know all of these are right answers, but we're simply trying to get an understanding of priorities here. What system-level change would have the greatest impact on embedding clinical trials into care in Canada? Okay, so, well, yeah. Higher fragmentation on this question. Incentives and accountability for health systems to include trials and care. Yeah, and the other one showing is strong national leadership, back to the leadership coordination across partners, which we're going to certainly chat about this afternoon some more. Great. Well-deserved break. We'll see everybody back here for 11:30.